We'll start recording, and you can go ahead when you're ready.
Hey guys, welcome to another week of the Two Guys on Politics podcast. This week I'm joined by former Congressman Bill Lipinski and Ray Hanania. Ray, do you want to kick us off on our first topic?
Yeah, and we were glad to be back here on July 7th, 2022. So the big news this week, obviously, was this horrendous killing of, now it looks like 7 people have died, I think. And a number of people were shot by a young man whose father helped him get some guns, got him a FOIA card, and he decided to go out and shoot some people. And this kid, Cremo, I think is his last name, they said was some kind of celebrity on social media. He did some songs. He got a lot of popularity. He was making money. And nobody knows what provoked or what prompted him to go out and just start shooting at a 4th of July parade in Highland Park. What is it with the world? This is like the 28th mass shooting, I think. Actually, 27 school shootings in the past year and over 210 mass shootings around the country. What is it? Or is it the media putting a spotlight, you think, on this stuff? Or is it just that some things are significant and other things aren't?
I wish I knew the answer. It's just horrendous, all the mass shootings that occur in this country now. And how you stop it, I don't know either. It's just, of course, this situation here, I understand, could have been stopped because there was a police officer that saw this guy going down the street. Oh, no, I take it back. That was the one.
Oh, that's in Uvalde. Yeah, the one in Uvalde. But that's a good point. The one in Texas, the police officer saw the guy going into the school, asked his commander, "What should I do?" And by the time he looked back, the guy got into the school. So
just terrible.
Why does he ask his commander what I should do when you see a guy with a gun, right, walking into a school? Well, I asked a police officer one time, I said, listen, why don't you just shoot to maim somebody? You don't have to kill them. And he said that that's a bad practice because if you shoot to maim, they'll still end up killing somebody if they're a bad guy. And, so it's not about a precaution. So it was kind of unfortunate that those 19 little kids were killed and there was an opportunity to stop them. But isn't this 2020 vision backseat driving, at the time in the middle of a crisis? How do you know what's happening? The police, this happened so fast. I feel bad for the police in Texas and how it's all been politicized, everybody fighting with each other now there. And it's become a political issue.
Well, how do we stop this? Do either one of you have an idea or ideas on how we can stop this from occurring?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. First, I always find it interesting. This may be anecdotal, but it seems like when there is a mass shooting of some sort, it seems like it gets a lot of coverage. And then the next couple down the timeline get a lot of coverage. And then somewhere along their lines, the legislation stalls or, talks about it stall. And then the coverage stops. And, they close that book on the news cycle, for, a couple months, put it away, and then revisit again the next time. It kind of seems appropriate to revisit that. So I guess the real question is, one, can you put the genie back in the bottle where we're a country where we have 2 guns for every 1 person? So it's unrealistic to say we can go backwards on that. But 2, is there actually any legislation that legitimately changes the situation? Because in Uvalde, the big conversation was Texas's lax gun laws, yada, yada. But here, no one seems to be talking about the gun laws, or they seem to be lower on the talking order list because we have very strong gun laws in Illinois. It didn't, prevent this, and it also doesn't prevent all the shootings that we see on the south side of Chicago. So I think it's kind of a twofold issue where, does media and the coverage of these things increase the rate of them? And two, do we have legitimate solutions that aren't just, ban all guns or, good guy with a gun beats a bad guy with a gun?
Well, I think that the news coverage of these mass shootings motivate other people to do the same thing, because they see the publicity these individuals receive with the mass shootings that they inflict upon people. And they like to see their picture on TV. They like to hear their name on the radio. And I really believe that that motivates some people to do these mass shootings. Now, I also believe that you have to be somewhat mentally unbalanced to have that affect you to the state where you're going to go out and murder people. But I believe the media coverage does unfortunately contribute to this. Now, I think we could pass some common sense gun laws. I don't see why we cannot once again ban assault weapons. We did it once for 10 years. I was there when it happened. We actually got the assault weapons, out of the country for the most part. Number two, we could pass legislation, I believe, that would get rid of these bullets that they have that explode when they come out of a body. I mean, it was so bad down there in Texas, they had to use DNA to identify these children. That's how bad they were shot up down there. So I think that those are very definitely two things, that we could do that are common sense. We certainly aren't going to confiscate all the guns in this country. It's not practical. It had never passed because of the Second Amendment. But those are two practical steps we could take. I also believe that there is no reason why we cannot push back up to 21 years of age the ability of an individual to purchase a weapon. All this stuff where it came down to 18 years of age is because of the Vietnam War. Ray, you probably remember this. You couldn't drink until you were 21. You couldn't purchase a gun until you were 21. You couldn't vote until you were 21. But because we had people in Vietnam fighting that were 18, 19, 20 years of age, there was a big push to push the voting age down to 18. And when that got down to 18, then they said, well, you should be able to drink, if you can vote, and right on. It just escalated that way. But to me, I don't see why we have no draft anymore in this country. So if you're in the military, you volunteered to go in the military. I don't know why we couldn't push it back up to 21. To me, those are three common sense things that could be done. It's not going to solve all our gun problems, but I think it would be a significant step in the right direction.
Yeah, listen, the argument about 18, I think is significant. We want to deny them all kinds of rights, but they're the ones that we put at the front lines of the war. We say, okay, we're going to draft you. We send you to war. You have to go fight and kill yourself and put your life at risk. Meanwhile, older people are staying at home. So if you can fight a war, they should have the right to have a gun. But I don't think it's the age. I think it's the attitude. I think it's the psychological experience of somebody. This kid in Highland Park obviously was a psycho. He was having problems. And if I had a kid like that, I would be realistic enough to recognize that this kid needs some help. I would not be going out to buy him guns. What father goes out and helps his son buy a gun? Why would you do that? Why? I don't want my son to have any guns. But I agree with you, Bill and Brian. I think we need some common sense, legislation about guns and weapons. But I think the problem is we have these two extremist movements that are fighting politically against each other. There's nobody in the center saying, well, yes, we should ban assault weapons and automatic weapons. Why should my neighbor have an automatic weapon, an AR-15, or who knows, an AK-47? Why should they have that? They shouldn't have that. Police should have that.
Well, but I'll then on the other side, real quick on the automatic. So the issue with banning automatic rifles, and the NRA will say this, Republicans will say this, the problem is any modern gun is an automatic rifle under the law that anyone drafts to ban them. So the issue is you're essentially putting everyone back to like 6-round revolvers, and that's it. And under the idea that, the right to bear arms should be protected. And I think it should be. I don't think you could legitimately pass legislation that says, we're banning essentially any gun made after 1900.
All right.
Yeah,
well,
listen.
I don't know that that's true. We banned assault weapons in this country for 10 years, did we not?
Assault weapons,
right.
Not automatic. So there's a distinction there that I don't think people make enough. Is
right.
When you're banning automatic, that is essentially anything that automatically reloads the next bullet into the chamber, right? That's banning basically every gun in America.
You're saying that's a broad definition.
It's too broad. And the issue is they jump to that, right? That's where we'll jump. They want to ban automatic, and that shouldn't be the first thing. They should say, we want to ban assault and start from that baseline. Because I think a lot more people
basically, if someone wants to have a handgun in their house legally and they qualify and they go through the process, they should have it to protect themselves. Concealed carry, they should have it. But if it's an assault weapon, if that's the definition of a gun that is one of these huge weapons that you might use in war, or an assault military or police team might use to fight against something. Yeah, I don't see why would you want that for hunting. So what I was trying to say was, on the one hand, we should have limits that apply to gun ownership, and there should be better background checks, and there should be a better process. I'm not against that. I don't want to see anybody take away guns that people legitimately should have. But on the other hand, I also think that we should stop using guns, the possession of guns, and say that that's why people are being killed. Because all three of us were law-abiding people. If they changed the law and they said we shouldn't have guns, we're law-abiding. I won't have a gun. But we're not going to be the killers. It's going to be some criminal that will break the law. And regardless of what the law is going to go out and find a way to get a gun, and he's going to get it and he's going to shoot it. So I don't believe the focus just on the guns is right. We need to focus on the people. And I think it goes back to parental responsibility. A lot of these shootings over the past year have been young kids in their teens. Are you telling me that the parents didn't know that their kids had these psychological problems, that they just snapped this kid in Highland Park? He just went off the deep end one day on July 4th. I don't believe that. I think that kid had problems, but nobody documented them. Nobody addressed them. Nobody recorded them. And I think in rich white, and I'm not trying to make this about race, but there is a difference in wealthier communities, which are predominantly white. They're going to coddle their kids more. They're going to take care of their kids. They're going to have money to soothe their kids, to address their kids, and protect their kids and not solve the problem. In the minority communities, in the lower income neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, they have barely two parents. They only have one parent. The mother's working all the time. A kid is probably out there going nuts, gets a gun and shoots somebody. Nobody's paying attention to these kids that are committing the crimes. And I think that's where a lot of this crime comes from. We're addressing the wrong problem, I think. Only the gun problem is not the answer. We have to address the whole thing across the board. And the two extremes won't allow us to do it.
Well, somehow we have to break through and get that done. And I didn't say anything that I know of about, banning automatic weapons. I talked about an assault rifle is what I talked about.
That was me. That was me. And because I've never owned a gun. I honestly don't know the difference between, when I talk about assault weapons and automatic weapons, I assume AR-15 is an automatic weapon. I don't consider a handgun as an automatic weapon, but those are definitions that I think the people that understand weapons should be able to parse through and, better define.
Well, anyone that would look at this young man who committed this terrible massacre in Highland Park, if you could look at him and not think that he had mental, emotional problems, then there's something wrong with you, because he looked like a very strange individual, and something should have been done to help him out before he wound up murdering 7 people and perhaps even more. But Brian, what's your position in regards to this?
With what exactly?
The whole situation on the guns.
Well,
and the mass murder and, mental health and that kind of stuff. I'd like to hear your position.
I think there's a couple of things. So first, I think when you start talking about common sense gun control, you're missing the point, because these things that are happening are fringe events, in the sense that these are people very much on the fringes. And as much as we want to think laws govern our lives, which they do, they don't govern the fringes, they govern the masses. So I think the idea that we're going to solve this with, like common sense gun control could be good, or it could be bad, but I don't think it solves this. I think it does go back to the mental health talking point, but I think we then generalize that and say, this is a mental health issue. And that's such a vague term that I don't know what that means. I don't think anyone knows what that means. I think it's just essentially a term of, putting it in a basket and saying, mental health caused this, because we can't really.
It's a layman's term.
Right.
Yeah, it's a layman's term. Go ahead.
So I think if we really need to look at these, you have to start looking at an individual level to each of these occurrences and see what we could have changed that both sides would agree on, that, could get passed, that would have changed the outcome of the certain event, right? In a lot of these, you can look back to the, is it Parkland in Florida, that shooting years ago, and the Uvalde one, both had police officers that were very close to the scene that didn't act. Okay, so that's one thing that seems to be interesting in some of these school shootings, is a lot of them actually have an officer near that could intervene in some way, and not prevent it entirely maybe, but could have helped more than they did. And then you look in scenarios like the one in Chicago, Highland Park. Those have a kind of different, path to them, where is clearly a troubled youth who had issues, but because we seal records and kind of treat young people from the ages of, 14, 15 to 18 with, kid gloves now, we didn't take it seriously that there could be a problem there. Some of the, complaints against this kid went unreported and weren't there to actually cross-check against Illinois' strong gun laws. So I think it's two pieces of possible legislation, but one for this specific scenario would be something along the lines of realistically looking at kids from the ages of 14 and 18. And if they start displaying behaviors that could lead to this, we flag them in some way that is able to pass through that kind of barrier of 18 of adulthood and kind of go from there.
Well, your point about the behavior of this one kid in Highland Park, that a lot of this information was suppressed from the public, but it wasn't suppressed from the parents. The parents had all the information. They had a right to all that information. They were aware of all that information. And so it's not the public's responsibility to say, hey, this kid has a history of problems. It's the parents that should be, I think, held accountable. They knew he had a history of problems. This is not a surprise to the mother and the father of this kid. This kid has had problems. It was a surprise to the public because we didn't see their records. But what's interesting to me is the way they react. Bill, when you were talking about how this kid, you could look at him, he looked like a psycho. He looked like he had a problem. This kid looked like he was not stable.
Absolutely.
But I look back at
just for 1 second. I said that I meant that. But is there any law that I could have gotten anything done, for this young man, simply because I think he looks like a psycho? And I'm sure that you two think he looks like a psycho. But what do we do about it? So I'm really somewhat misspeaking here when I say, everybody knows this guy is a psycho. But what do we do about it? Go ahead, Ray. I'm sorry.
Well, no, that's all right. I think you raise a good point, because the image of him being quote unquote psycho, and I'm not saying that's what you or I or any of us are saying, he was perceived that way by the media reports. The photos they put out, they could have put a picture of him in a suit with a graduation cap and a tassel on his head. What happens on the south side of Chicago? A street gang thug who's on drugs, carrying a weapon, is 2:00 in the morning, gets shot. He confronts the police, he gets shot. And the next day, the media says, oh, this poor minority kid was killed by the police. And what picture do they show? They show his graduation picture. This kid had a future. This kid was in school. That's not what they're saying about this white kid. It's easier to go after a white kid and really tear him to pieces than it is to go after a minority kid. And I'm not saying that we should just treat the two races differently. We should treat them both the same. We should see what that street gang member really was like. Why is it that we have all this focus on Highland Park, and at the same weekend as the 4th of July, how many people were killed in Chicago? 12? We don't even know who the shooters were. It could be one shooter killing all those people, which is probably unlikely, but we don't know. We don't know who the suspects are.
But that's routine. That's not really news. So the news media.
Because the media, right. It's routine and it's not news because the news media doesn't make it news. And they make the argument about controlling guns, blaming the police. The police are irresponsible in Chicago. The guns are the issue in Highland Park. There's no consistency in the argument. It's all political.
I want to say, I think both of you have probably read or heard about this police car with a female and male police officer in it that was attacked by a group of youth, both they say black and white. But after they stopped attacking the car, breaking the windows, threatening the officers were not allowed to get out of their car and chase these young people because of the new policy implemented by the Chicago Police Department. Ludicrous, absolutely.
Led by the mayor more than the police department. If we would leave the police to do their job, people aren't afraid of the police. I think they need to be afraid, not the regular everyday people, but people that are going to commit crimes. They need to be afraid of the police. And what would they have done if that car, instead of being a police car, had been the mayor's limousine and they had stopped to start pound? Do you think Bill and I and Brian, we could go to Chicago, we see the mayor go by, we run in front of her car, stop pounding it? What do you think they would do to us?
They would beat us. We'll make the news.
We would be arrested. We would be described as psychos, and they would have jailed us without a thought. The media would pound us. But you take some kids, minority kids, white kids, and a mayor who doesn't want to address the problem, and they destroy a police car with the police officer in it, and the police can't do anything, and it's all caught on video. I just kept thinking, what would people have said if that were Lori Lightfoot's limousine and people were doing that to her? What do you think she would have done? I bet 10 people would have been shot.
Well, I think we had to invite Lori on our podcast next week and see if she could answer some of these questions. I think that'd really be quite interesting. But let's get back to the main topic we're on here. What can be done about these mass shootings? Can we pass some legislation that will help the situation? Can the news media do anything about it? What can be done? Can some law be enacted that would say, this guy looks like a psycho, so let's take him in, let's have him be evaluated by, professional people? Can that be done?
Well, I think the most interesting argument would be to do something where, on applications for your FOID card or, on your purchasing of certain guns, ammunition, etc., if the background check could include underage, as in under 18 behavior and something along those lines, because you have to look at it from the two sides of, most people who are, proud gun owners in this country don't live in cities. people who have a tradition of gun ownership in their families, grew up on it, use it for hunting, those kind of things. Once you start introducing these kind of hoops to jump through, they see it as ridiculous that you would have to do that, because there's such a tradition of it in their families that, you teach the kids how to use a gun. You go through you teach the kids how to, properly handle it, yada, yada. And it's so absurd that then, you add something like, oh, you need a mental health check before you can buy a gun. So someone in Southern Illinois looks at that and thinks it's ridiculous. I've been taught this from 2 years old. Why do I need a mental health check to go do this? So you have this kind of distribution of people in America and how they view guns. And then the legislation for these two things, it gets stalled in Congress because you can't fight over it that way. Because no one in Southern Illinois wants to have to go, to Champaign or, to Chicago to get a health check by some random state official to say that they can get a gun. So I think it really does come down to personal responsibility, in the sense that, people saw questionable behavior from this individual before. People could have done things, and there needs to be an outlet for that, but it needs to be a proactive thing where in this scenario, there were reports. Those reports should have been taken into account and then used. But you shouldn't just blanket say everyone who wants a gun has to do X, Y, and Z. The hoops should be put in front of people who are flagged, not vice versa.
Well, I understand what you're talking about. And certainly, right now we have a Republican candidate running for governor of Illinois who proudly talks about, protecting the Second Amendment. And he's got commercials shooting his big long rifle at something, a target, or I have no idea what it is. But I mean, he was the Republican nominee for governor. He is. And as I pointed out once before, I'm going to point out, he not only carried Southern Illinois in Central Illinois, he also carried the collar counties. He carried Cook County. And believe it or not, in the small number of Republican votes that are in the city of Chicago, he carried the city of Chicago. So you see the tremendous, I look at guns and say, if it was possible to confiscate all the guns, I would go ahead and advocate doing that. It's not possible. It's against the Second Amendment. So we have to find some other common sense things. But common sense things to me, just like Brian pointed out, to people in Southern Illinois, that's ridiculous. Why should I have to do this? That's why such a problem.
Yeah, I don't believe that the only issue is guns. I think the issue has to do with the ability to get guns. I think the issue has to do with the politicization of this, the way the news media covers it. I think it's pandered to by the right and far left. And nothing's going to change because, listen, you cannot prevent crime. You can't prevent it unless we're going to start getting psychics to look at you or me and say, oh, am I going to commit a crime in 5 minutes? You might be able to stop me. But then we'll never know if I commit a crime. So you can't
right now because I'm looking at you and I think you might be about to.
It's very possible.
Yes,
it's very possible. But the point is, we can't stop crime. What we can do is make it the punishment for a crime so prohibitive that when you commit it, at least not every criminal is going to care, but enough of the criminals are going to say, I do not want to go to jail for shooting a gun at a police officer for 30 years. I don't want to go to jail for 30 years. And I think that half the people that use guns might think twice about using a gun or killing somebody if they knew there wasn't going to be some leniency from the Cook County State's Attorney or other liberal state's attorneys that are going to say, oh, the poor guy, he had a bad family life. He doesn't have a father. The mother was working. It's not any, look at how well he tried to do in high school. Here's his picture with his graduation garb on. I think that we need to toughen the crimes. We need to shove them in jails. We need to stop being lenient. And until we do that, we're not going to stop anything. We can reduce crime, we will never eliminate it.
I agree with you in regards to the situations you're talking about. But truthfully, Ray, those people have nothing to do with the mass murders that are going on in this country. Okay. These people who commit the mass murder, they don't think about how much time they're going to spend. They don't think about.
No, I get that.
The police are, they get it in their head. They're going to, kill people. Then they can sit down with the police and the prosecutor and tell them all about it. And they sort of become stars, okay? And the news media covers them. Well, I'm repeating myself. I'm just saying.
No, but you're right. There's different kinds of crime. You're absolutely right. There's mass murders. But then there were more people killed in Chicago that 4th of July weekend than there was in Highland Park. So we have to look at the bigger picture of crime and say, yeah, there are different kinds of crimes taking place, and each one deserves a different approach. But we're not dealing with the everyday crime where people are being killed on the street, and nobody seems to care about Chicago. And the criminals, they get out. Instead of going to jail, they're released on I-bonds. They're not being put in prison because the prisons are crowded. I don't care whether the prison's crowded. I hope they choke to death in a prison. If they're convicted and if they're guilty, why do we have to worry about them? Why do I have to think about them? I'd rather think about innocent people like us, our families, protecting our families from those criminals. Throw away the key. I could care less about them. And then work with them if you want to try to reform them. But I think that we're too lenient. And if I were a criminal, I'd be saying, hey, why are we committing a crime in Will County? Let's go to Cook County. The chances of committing a crime and getting off the hook are going to be 10 times better. And I think we're sending that message out. We're encouraging crime, so it's very disappointing. Anyway.
When we invite Lloyd Lightfoot on for next week's podcast, we should also invite Kim Fox on. I think that'd be a very interesting program with the two of them on.
I think we should greet their vehicles as they come in and stomp on them and see what kind of reaction they get when they come in here. My sense is they'd have a shot.
No, not them. Okay.
They'd shoot us. All right. Anyway, let's, Brian, you had a topic about gridlock. We were going to end the program with the gridlock in Washington, D.C. What do you mean by that? Nothing is getting done in the Capitol?
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about that because, it seems like after every grouping of mass shootings in this country, we have some new push for gun legislation, specifically on the federal level. And we end up with this gridlock where the Republicans say no to some of the crazy Democrat ideas. And then, anything reasonable gets killed in the bill because the bill has too much in it. So I was listening to a House Judiciary Committee hearing by Anton Scalia, the late justice who passed away a couple of years ago. And he was talking about how unique America is in the sense of its structure. Talking about how actually the Bill of Rights isn't that novel of an idea or isn't that new of an idea. The USSR had a Bill of Rights that was probably stronger than ours. Any country throughout the world has a Bill of Rights that's just as strong, if not stronger. That's not what gives America its strength. Instead, it's the structure of government that we have and the difference of it between other countries. Russia, the USSR, different countries like that have one executive power. Even European countries that have freedom and all these different things, a similar Bill of Rights, they have a legislature, but the legislature votes for the executive in the way that, in England, they have the parliament and then the PM. America, we're very different, and that leads to a lot of gridlock. We're different because we have these two separate legislative bodies that are elected differently, the Senate being 2 per state, and the House being population-based. And then the executive is an outside entity to make another wing. And what we was talking about was, due to this structure, we actually create a lot of gridlock in our country, but that's what the founders intended. We constantly talk about this gridlock in Washington. And, I've been around long enough to hear it 2 or 3 different times. And I think the argument is that's actually good, not bad. People always, frame this in the idea that, Washington is gridlock, nothing's getting done, yada, yada. And I think the idea behind that is it should be hard to do things in Washington because of the structure of government. Government shouldn't be easy to enact X, Y, and Z law. They should have to go through 2 separate branches of the legislature or separate houses of the legislature and then into the executive branch. So as we kind of see these battles over gun control and these different aspects of the country, I think we're going to see a lot more calls to the adding Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. as additional states, which would lead to essentially 4 new Democratic senators and give them more control of the Senate, the Democrats, that is. I think we should look back and kind of appreciate more the gridlock and what it actually provides us rather than just simply detracts.
Well, that's very, very interesting. I think it's a very extensive subject that we could get into. We certainly don't have the time to get into it today, but I would really like to see us talk about that on a program, a full program next week or the following week, because there are points that Brian makes I agree with. The founding fathers really intended for that to be the way things work. And that's why we have the 2 houses, as he says. That's why we don't have a parliament. We have 2 houses of legislative bodies, and we have a president. Frankly, I believe at the present time, the president, whether he be Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, they have too much executive power as far as I'm concerned. That has to be checked. Unfortunately, we don't have enough courageous people in government to take it to court and have the court rule against the president, no matter who it is. They're acting like dictators. But I think this is a subject we should get into.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that we rely on this principle that the majority rules. And when we define the word majority, we're talking about 50% plus 1 vote. I think that really we should have consensus rules. And that's why I support the filibuster, because it requires at least 60% to stop something, not just, a majority of 50%. If 60% of a body of the Congress wants to stop something, then I'm going to say, okay, that represents closer to the will of the people, to have a larger majority like that doing something than just a 50-50 split the way we have. Because in a world that's divided the way we are and polarized today, 50-50 is a bad situation. It may be good for pop, but it's not good for politics. So I don't know. We should talk about this a little bit more. But you know what made me, as we were talking, I was thinking about how our show is a lot like that one TV show that they used to have called The Sports Writers with, I think, what was it, Bill Joust, Bill Gleason, Ben Bentley. You remember Ben Bentley?
I remember.
And Rick Thielander.
Well.
Yeah, right. I remember those guys. So I think in our next episode, we should be 2 guys on politics, the politics writers, and we should each have a cigar, and we'll talk about these, dems, and does more often, okay? But I think we had a great discussion, and I think we should do something more on gridlock, in the future.
I certainly agree with that. No question about it. Now I got to go get my cigar, my hat, and enjoy the White Sox great victory yesterday. See you next week, folks.
All right. I'm Ray Hanania.
I'm Brian Broeking.
And Bill?
I'm Bill Lipinski.
And this is 2 guys on politics with our producer, Brian Broeking, who brings a very interesting youth perspective and segment every episode. We'll see you again next Thursday, right here on Facebook and on our podcast. Thanks, everybody.